co-organized by the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa and the International Development Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Iyob Balcha-Gebremariam. I'm a fellow at the International Development Department and convener of the African Development course in the just ended academic year. The title of our today's event is Decolonising Development Studies, Practical Steps in Course Designing, Reading Selections, and Classroom Discussions. I took the initiative of co-organizing this webinar with my colleagues at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa and the International Development Department after, I would say, a successful year of convening the African Development course. I revised the course that I inherited from my colleagues, the late Professor Tandika Mkindware and Dr. Laura Mann, using decolonial perspectives. There are several reasons to teach or study development studies in general and African development in particular using decolonial perspectives. One of the reasons can be, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos argues, there cannot be social justice without cognitive justice, or as Sabelo Nvulugatsheni illustrated in his very influential work, that political and economic freedom cannot be realized without full epistemic freedom. I'm sure there are several other equally valid reasons why we need to decolonize academia or the overall socio-economic and political systems across the world. However, our task today is particularly focused on the practical issues around organizing and delivering a course using decolonial perspectives. Epistemological, methodological, theoretical, or conceptual debates cannot continue forever without particularly addressing some of the challenges and also opportunities that we have in terms of course designing, the use and selection of reading materials, and most importantly, in handling discussions and debates with our students. We have invited three guests to share with us their perspectives and also practical experiences with this regard. I will introduce them briefly before going to the first round of our contribution. Then I will ask our first speaker to take the floor. So our first speaker is Dr. Rosalva Ikaja. Dr. Rosalva is a decolonial feminist and associate professor in global politics, gender, and diversity at the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. She is a member of the Red Transnational Autoros Saberes, co-convenes the Transnational Learning Group, Nurturing Each Other, and collaborates with Samuli Mokhtan in Sanchez. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it properly, Rosalva, in Yucatan, Mexico. And Dr. Rosalva is joining us from Mexico City, in Mexico. Our second speaker in the first round is Dr. Jirga Gala-Woldeyes. Jirga is a senior lecturer, multidisciplinary researcher, and writer based in Curtin University's Center for Human Rights Education. His research focuses on the critical study of development, education, and law, and the importance of lived experiences and epistemic diversity for decolonial and sustainable futures. Dr. Woldeyes teaches postgraduate courses face-to-face and online, and he has won university and industry awards for teaching, research, and creative writing. Dr. Jirga is joining us from Perth, Western Australia. So as you can see, there is 13 hours difference between our first and second speaker. Our third speaker is in the first round is Dr. Althea Maria Rivas. Althea Maria is a lecturer in global development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. She has held positions at Sussex University and York University in Toronto. Althea Maria's research focuses on exploring the politics of development, conflict, humanitarian intervention, and peace through the lens of the everyday. Before starting her academic career, Althea Maria worked for 12 years in the areas of diplomacy, post-conflict reconstruction, gender and development, and governance with various international NGOs and local international organizations in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Dr. Alta Maria is joining us from London. We will run the seminar in 3 rounds using guiding questions and also with brief moments of responding to questions from our virtual participants. And we'll have at least a maximum of 10 minutes to respond to your questions or comments. So feel free to forward your questions starting from the presentation from our first speaker. My colleagues, Kojo Adebayo from the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa and Anna Galton from the International Development Department will help me in moderating and forwarding the questions so that I can present it to our speakers. So I will ask our first speaker, Dr. Rosalba, to present her views, particularly using these guiding questions that I've prepared. That is, from your experience, what are the key challenges and opportunities in designing courses using decolonial perspectives? If possible, would be happy to hear practical steps that you took to address the challenge and also to maximize on the opportunities. You have 5 minutes, Dr. Rosalba. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ajel. Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to say that I'm very happy to be here. It was a beautiful invitation, especially as a former student of ISS. I couldn't say no. So I'm very happy. I'm honored that you thought of me to be here. This is the first time that I'm also hosted by an institute that is focused on African studies, which is not surprising. And this is what I want to start today. Given that the whole area, well, the whole idea of area studies is a modern colonial construction and a misrepresentation of the plurality of the world. So it's really very few opportunities that I have had in my life to engage with scholars from Africa or experts in different countries from the continent. And often the case is that I'm asked to represent actually all Latin America, or speak on behalf of all Latinas, which is, as I have just mentioned, one of the misrepresentation of the modern colonial institutions in which we work. But in relation to the question that you asked us to reflect about the challenges, I want to share with you 3 main challenges, and if I have time, speak a little bit about the opportunities that I see go hand in hand with these challenges. And the first one is what I have just referred to as a decolonial feminist teacher. I think that we, in the field of development studies, we are constantly challenged with the fact that we give so much attention to what divides us in terms of the different colonial genealogies that mark how these different regions of the world are being misrepresented, appropriated. And there are different ways in which we are confronted to find ways of learning each other, despite this misrepresentation, despite these imperial designs that keep us ignorant from each other. So this is the first challenge that I want to put on the table. The second challenge is that I have encountered a lot of lack of safety in the field of development studies. Let me be more specific about that. In January this year, I chair a panel where all the speakers were women of color working in the field of development studies. They are researchers, practitioners, teachers. And we articulated a common point of departure as one that takes the field of development studies as unsafe for dialogue and for learning each other in the way that Afro-Caribbean feminist Jackie Alexander invited us to do. So we are, as women of color, decolonial feminists, finding inspiration, for example, from decolonial feminist philosopher and popular educator, Maria Lugones, in calling ourselves women of color, a term that mediates our coalitional doings among those who enflesh epistemologies, but also ontologies, histories, bodies, that remain outside dominant feminist theoretical praxis and politics within the field of development studies, but also outside the field. And the third challenge that I would like to mention today is the challenge of positionality. We're constantly asking where we position across the colonial divide when we redesign curricula that takes into account decolonial thinking, a praxis of ethical orientation that emerged from struggles for land in the context of Aviala. And therefore, we are constantly asking when we engage in redesigning our curricula, in which ways we are implicated in the suffering and the consumption of the life of others and of Earth. This is our ethical orientation when thinking about curricula. Overall, what we have found is that teaching in development studies has failed to be geohistorically positioned. With this, I mean that the way we transmit knowledge that we generate via research is not positioned and often contributes to occlude instead of revealing the geo and body political location of the knowledge we are teaching. And this has been expressed in the consumption of decolonial thinking as just another approach to be added into our curricula, which is something that we, as decolonial feminists, are very concerned about. I think that I still have 1 minute, isn't it? So let me just briefly tell you about the opportunities that I think are open in relation to these three challenges that I just put on the table: the lack of space to learn each other, the unsafety of the field, and the question of positionality. I think that as decolonial feminist, my point of departure while redesigning the curricula in the field of development studies is acknowledging that universities and therefore curricula as we know them today are a consequence of the expansion of European modernizing project, just like the nation states and the capitalist system. So as decolonial feminists, we are articulating how this origin has been constantly covered up by normative claims of higher education as a positive common good. A decolonial perspective on universities understands them as implicated in the epistemic violence present in modern colonial geopolitics of knowledge and in the reproduction of epistemic apparatuses that perpetuates those inequalities that made us desire to go to Europe and be educated by European institutions. And more concretely, in my teaching, this has meant, in my classroom, this has meant to invest time in the classroom in each session to show how the access of differentiation along race, class, gender have been essential for establishing the disciplinary canon of development studies, and concurrently, how these canons have been essential to reproduce this access of discrimination. Perhaps in the following intervention, I can expand a little bit about this last point.
Okay, that was a very useful introduction to our panel, to our webinar. And I hope our participants have already noted some key issues that Rosalba has highlighted. And I would politely ask you all to raise questions and comments or something that you want her to clarify further. So I will give the floor to our second speaker, Dr. Yirga Galau. Can you share with us your experience and also what are the key challenges that you face in terms of designing courses using decolonial perspectives? And you also have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think I would probably prefer to say a little bit the motivation, the ways in which I was drawn to develop or to follow a decolonial approach to my teaching. I say that because it's very relevant to bringing voices that are not familiar, that are not available in the academia. As you know, I'm from Ethiopia, and as an Ethiopian, we are associated with poverty, and the development is usually something that tries to bring people out of poverty. But poverty as a concept is different from the lived experience that I have as a person living in Ethiopia. Growing up in Ethiopia, especially being close to rural side of Ethiopia, I grew up very close to nature, and I learned in the traditional Ethiopian education system from scholars, priests, monks, and farmers who have enormous knowledges and ideas about the world. But when I went to education, everything that existed in my experience has been excluded, and we've been told through education that we are poor, And in order to change our lives, we must understand Western knowledge. We must abandon our language and study in English. And in that process, then I found myself or discovered myself with this imposed identity of poverty. So for me, it is a realization that poverty is not about poor people. It's not about helping people to have food or clothing and so on. It is instead to invent a category called poor and associate it with what Westerners or capitalists can offer or can do to advance their own interests. And the second point I want to relate with this is the question of education, how we are educated in places like Ethiopia, where education becomes a process of alienating people from their lived experiences and cultures. And a place or a country that has enormous diversity and history, where probably 99% of the people do not speak a European language, the higher education system and universities are taught in English. And it's very difficult even to let people who study in that system understand that this is a form of mental slavery. This is a form of epistemicide, the killing of our knowledges, the killing of our languages, and so on. So, faced with this lived experience and with this reality, when I get the chance to teach in this postgraduate class about development and human rights, the idea was, what are the ways, how can I approach or create a course that can bring these issues into the floor, because the issues are also shared across other places. So in the way, the designing of a course around decolonial or critical ideas is by considering how domination, how these ideas of development on human rights are reproduced and distributed to different parts of the world and are also imposed in people's ideas to give them identities that can be governed and controlled. So one aim is to resist that domination. The second important aim is to listen to or understand the silenced voices, the voices that are not heard in academia, in universities, and so on. So the challenge that comes with this type of aim, obviously, is how to find these voices, how to listen to those ideas. For example, when I was in Ethiopia growing up in the rural side of the country, the ideas that I learned from those people, it's very hard to bring them into the university and talk about them. Where I live in Australia, where indigenous people lived for centuries, but academia is dominated by the ideas that are produced since the white community or the white society came to Australia. So bringing that voice to the floor requires an enormous exercise in trying to articulate, to find those voices from different fields. I'll probably say more later on in terms of how we could be able to do that. So in a nutshell, to achieve this aim of resisting domination and finding new voices, designing the course involves creating this, especially in relation to development, thinking areas where systems of domination are occurring. For example, critically studying about institutions. We have institutions such as, including the nation state, which is a recent colonial construction, which perpetuates itself through critically thinking about the nation state itself, critically thinking about corporations, thinking about international financial institutions, which are financial governing institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. What are their voting mechanisms? What are their operations, and what are the language they use? So thinking about this area is very important as institutions. Another area is thinking about knowledge or ideas that are dominant. For example, studying theories instead of lived experiences, where we start from concepts such as the state of nature, scarcity, economic concepts. All of these things take us away from the lived experience of people, from the daily languages that they have. So thinking about ideas and working in a kind of decolonial way around those ideas becomes important. And certainly also thinking about practices. We can consider, for example, policies, programs, aid, foreign aid, for example. A lot of people assume that aid is given to alleviate hunger and for humanitarian purposes, but a very insignificant little amount of aid goes to that area, whereas significant amount of aid is given to adjust and maintain a colonial structure that continuously perpetuates the subjugated or lower status of these poor countries. So studying on these different areas, I also think about methodologies, and a methodology that one of the methodologies that I follow is what I call a critical appreciative dialogue. By critical appreciative dialogue, I'm looking critically at systems of knowledges, ideas, institutions, and practices that dominate people. So we need that critical language that the students can have the ability to articulate their own voices and critically see the world, but also appreciative in a sense that what are the ways in which we can appreciate the existence of life, knowledge, ideas, creativity, resilience within and among people who are excluded, who are forgotten, who are left outside of the discourse of development. Okay. And the dialogue is then bringing these things together in general. So I think...
Can I ask you to wrap up, Ilga?
Yeah.
Can I ask you to wrap up and move to the third speaker, and we'll definitely have more time to raise lots of other issues.
Shall I start?
Hello,
Yuga, have you finished? I didn't want to interrupt you. I just want you to conclude.
Thank you so much. I didn't. I sometimes don't notice the time. That's my problem, as you know.
Okay.
No problem. Okay. So I have finished. Just in a sentence, what I was trying to say was, I start from my lived experience, so that I encourage students to talk about their lived experiences, and then I go to the designing the course by thinking its aim, and also thinking about different areas where we should critically engage, and also finally by trying to appreciate the ways in which new ideas and new insights can be drawn from. Okay, great. Thank you, Yuga. I think you presented us both an insightful way of organizing a course, but also I think it's quite challenging because it might be difficult for us as educators to find relevant materials that will support our ideas, and also even how to translate this into a course, or how to shape classroom discussions and debates might also be another layer of challenge. So we'll definitely have more time to raise all those issues, and thank you for your contribution. So I'll give the floor to Altea Maria and respond to the same question. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, I probably won't take 5 minutes. I just have a few points that I wanted to touch on, and both Rosalba and Yoga have touched on some of these already, I think. So for me, the greatest challenges are often institutional dynamics, and particularly, to be honest, the weight of whiteness, white fragility in the academy, and elitism. And that manifests itself in different ways. So in one of the ways in which it manifests itself is just the refusal to engage with different types of knowledge, different ways of being, and also different bodies beyond the narratives of suffering within the academy. So for me, the decolonial imperative involves a decentering of Europe and a dismantling of power. Like, that is at the core of the project. And that means really a shifting of power in the academy and in higher education institutions, which also has it's not just a theoretical thing, right? It has very material and everyday consequences that many academics and researchers and also students sometimes are not willing to engage with. And so the pushback or refusal to engage with, decolonizing the curriculum of educational justice to allow different approaches into the academy, it has been notable. And I think, it's important to state that and to not go along with the kind of common discourse now that everybody's kind of on board with this, right? Because that's really not the case. And I think it's important when this pushback occurs to name these behaviors for what they are. So therefore to actively name racism in terms of the blockages that are put up by those in the academy against kind of the decolonial projects, against scholars of color, against different ways of knowing, and that being incorporated into what we see as valid knowledge and ways of being. Another way that this manifests itself, and Rosalba talked about this as well, particularly in terms of the experience of women of color academics, and that's, I think, the hijacking of the decolonial and also the anti-racism discourse by institutions and academics that ultimately, I think, a lot of the time want to recenter themselves and recenter Europe through using, particular ideas and terminologies. So the Decolonizing the University student movement and BLM have called for a more public debate on the colonial nature of knowledge in the university, but also the need to address racial injustice globally. And both of these struggles are decades and actually centuries long, right? So they're not new struggles, but there's been this focus on them that's because of these two movements, and that's notable and important. However, now I think too often those who actively practice racism and microaggressions against colleagues of color and students sometimes now also want to adopt the decolonial and anti-racist language and therefore center themselves in this work. And that makes it difficult for scholars of color or those who are committed to social and educational justice in particular to do that work, right? Because we're forced to do it in unsafe spaces, and that causes emotional stress. It prevents careers from moving forward. It makes it difficult to exist within the space of the academy, really. And so I think those are two really important challenges that I've encountered and that many of my colleagues of color and allies have encountered. And in terms of strategies, I think, one of them is to call out racism and Eurocentrism. So to name that behavior when we see it, right? And to not let it be excused as, academic independence, for example, right? Or the appropriate things that students need to learn as part of the canon, because that in itself is objectable. And also, there's a need to create safe spaces, like Rosalba talked about, that she had done this year and before, to do the work with colleagues and of color, but also, white allies who are interested in and have the same types of politics, right? Because it's not just a matter of, and I think we'll talk about this in the next question, just, reforming or changing the curriculum. It's political, right? And also maybe thinking about different types of spaces or creating different types of spaces in the academy or outside of the academy that can be learning spaces, right, where we can do this work. So learning doesn't always just have to take place in the academy. And actually, the decolonial knowledge, that knowledge is in the community itself. It's not in the academy, right? So rethinking kind of what we see as valid spaces of knowledge production and cultivation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Althea. And I think the specific issue that you have highlighted at the beginning of your presentation, the institutional dynamics and the extent to which that institutional setting is not an easy ground to operate such kinds of ideas, and also both implicit and explicit challenges that are embedded within this institutional system is quite a key issue for us to highlight. So I was just looking at some of the questions that were forwarded by our participants. One thing that I've highlighted here is how institutions can act in order to create safer space for development studies. I think a question by Leticia Barbosa. Okay. I hope my colleagues, either Anna or Kojo, will help me in collating some of the questions. While doing so, I have a couple of questions both for all of you. One, in terms of, particularly for Rosalba, you mentioned about the idea that one of the challenges that we have is to make sure that knowledge is situated in certain kind of geopolitical or epistemological position. And one thing that the mainstream knowledge managed to do is to present itself as something that is universal, so that anyone has to accept it and adopt it as part of their learning process. And one thing that the decolonial perspective tries to unravel is that knowledge is situated in certain historical, temporal, or even geopolitical context. I would really appreciate if you can go further in making this much more clear for anyone who wants to organize their courses in terms of using the colonial perspective, particularly in a sense that we cannot take one particular history as a universal history or one particular center, that means usually Europe or the Westerners socio-economic and political history, as a point of departure to understand everything across the world. I would be glad if you emphasize on that first. And then I will go to another question, a question and comment for all panelists from the Giju Samuel Bayene. How is it possible for us to decolonize development studies when all the concepts, theories, and principles by which we are guiding our education systems are rooted in Western ideology? In my view, that is the Giju's view, our education system has been neglecting the indigenous knowledge and practice, and that is one of the areas where we need to start the intervention. I think Jirga would be well positioned to respond to this question as well. I would also invite both Rosalba and Altea to respond to this. And let's have these questions in our first round. Rosalba, would you please start?
Yes. Well, the challenge of positionality, and I think that at the same time we'll be tapping into some of the comments that Jirga and Altea have already mentioned. The way I practically do is actually following one of the key questions that Olivia Rutatsiwa asked us to those teachers positioned in the global north to think about how we teach about development studies. And it's a very practical and simple, but at the same time, very difficult question to answer. And it's, where do we start to tell the story of development? And I normally start with that question in my courses. I'm constantly asking students, okay, where did you hear the first time in your life that you didn't know, that you weren't, that the experience of your life or those of your ancestors were actually ignorance, where this happened? And actually, in most of the cases of the students that I teach in the context of an European institution in the Netherlands that happens to be students like me from the global south, nonetheless elites because they can speak English, but that they discover themselves racialized the moment they put a feet in the train going from Schiphol to the Hague. And the common answer is in the school. It is in the school, it's in the formal system of education where ideas of my own experience, my own life experience as not worthy to be understood, to be explored further, to actually share with others, is a moment when I'm constructed and built upon as a knowledgeable subject. And this is something that immediately creates a very interesting, and you experience that job, a very interesting, let's say, environment and possibility in the classroom. When we realize that it is a particular institution that creates these ideas of who we are supposed to be in the face of expertise, or when we are confronted with experts on our countries that come from other countries, but they claim to be experts. That is something that I found extremely violent. And actually, I laugh a lot when I found in the UK, when I was doing my PhD, experts on Mexico telling me what Mexico was about. And I always respond to them, well, I'm not an expert on Mexico. I can say very little about a very tiny area of the country where I was born and raised, but I cannot claim any expertise on a country of 150 million or something like that. But anyway, so that is something that I want to say. I always start with this very practical question in the first session of my classrooms, of my courses. Where do we start to tell the story of what is development? Now, I'm someone that never studied development. I always say this to my students. I'm someone that was trained to be an international relations scholar. So I don't know what is to do development, but I'm nonetheless a product of development, of course. And I always position and situate my own story as someone coming from Latin America, from a specific set of policies that targeting working class women like my mother, who were very much encouraged to have a particular way of raising kids, raising especially girls, who were supposed to go through education in order to be developed, in order to be autonomous, and so forth. So it's always a dialogue with a personal story as a product of urbanization, industrialization, 1970s in Mexico. But I always come back to the key question that, from my point of view, is connected to the ethics and the politics of the decolonial, and is what for? Why are we actually doing this? Why are we actually recovering the voices? Is because we want to educate others with these voices? Is because these voices are going to be consumed again to be incorporated into curriculums? Or there is something else that we can actually do as mentors and teachers when confronting, because sometimes it's a confrontation, students who don't want to learn from these other experiences that are not the mainstream Western experiences of what is supposed to be a modern subject. So these three simple but important questions are like the first introductory elements of any course that I teach. And it's not only about development studies. I think that this can be, of course, posed in each of the courses that we can be designing, but they have this component of positionality, experience, ethics, and I cannot remember the first one, but this is more or less what I do.
Okay, great. I would ask Althea to respond, to go next and respond to some of the questions. There are lots of questions coming. So here's one question from Natasha Wimanzi. Do the colonial spaces have to be exclusive in order to progress the agenda swiftly and accurately? Or is there a space to incorporate those voices who have not grasped the ideas of decolonization and might still be using its language, but not its principles? I think the question directly responds to one of the issues that you talked about, that's the capturing of this, the decolonial agenda. And also from Natasha, related to her first question, there is a school of thought that believes that in order to decolonizing development, one must dismantle the entire institution. What are your thoughts on that, Althea?
Yeah, so I think there are, a safe space doesn't have to just be a space for scholars of color, right? And we don't want to essentialize. I saw there was another question in the chat about being situated in the global north. We don't want to essentialize people either, right? So we all have complex and different experiences, and really it's about your politics, right? And as Rosalba was saying, the purpose of what you're doing. So I actually favor a team approach in kind of like decolonizing knowledge and knowledge production, where it's not just a matter of a few faculty of color, right? Because that puts all of the burden on particular racialized bodies. But the responsibility is more than that. And actually, if it's only a few people who's doing it, then often the work that you do in a department, for example, is canceled out by the kind of Eurocentric knowledge and Orientalism that is situated within the department. So you have one course and one person of color doing something that's different or bringing in different types of knowledge, and 25 that are, very deeply steeped in kind of Eurocentrism, right? So they kind of cancel each other out, or cancels out the work that you're doing. But I think a political commitment is also really important, that kind of provides the space and time for people to work together, to rethink department narratives and modules systematically through a structured approach, and that gives the resources and for people to do this and provide some sort of accountability mechanism and resources, right? And that team approach, right, with people with the correct politics, right, or the same similar politics, it creates a sense of shared responsibility, of ownership, and a public acknowledgement that things need to be done differently. And I think using that approach, it kind of moves from something, decolonizing the curriculum, which is more narrow, to embedding different ecologies of knowledge within kind of within the academic space, right, and the spaces in the department or the other spaces that we kind of occupy.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks a lot, Althea. And there are also some questions. The education aspect, Jirga, would you mind responding to that question? Plus, there are also a couple of questions directed to you from Roy Chandroy. She's asking, does Dr. Jirga have any suggestions to read about deconstructing or decolonizing the concept of poverty? And also about the people who like to know more about the critical appreciative dialogue that you mentioned. How does it work, or some elaboration around these areas? So I know we are kind of being bombarded by very useful questions, but let's try to be as brief as possible so that we respond to other questions as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be brief. For the first question about education, I think it's really very important to think of the problem of education. One of the big problems is that in education, the students do not exist. We are not part of the education process. Our language, our experience is not part of education. I mean, there is no any, I don't know if there is any other example in the world where education can become so crazy as it is in Ethiopia, where you would go to, when I studied law, I studied in English, although law is promulgated, legislated in the local language. And also I'm meant to go out and practice in the local language. Then I was taught in a language that I would not use to practice. Even my teachers know the local language better than English. So I think it's important to understand what it is doing to us. It is creating a form of mental epistemic or mental slavery where our very sense of reality is so much distorted. And I think understanding that, especially in the places like Ethiopia and other places too, is important to know, to understand, or to be really moved towards changing the system, the medium of education, the content of education, how it can be done could come after realizing these issues. And one of the things that's stopping us also from doing is our own interest. We are implicit in the system, unless the knowledge I have is privileged back in Ethiopia, I wouldn't be able to go and become a professor there and gain the privilege and so on. So really, it's important to understand that education is about few people who benefit from the system. It's not about helping people. It's not about changing the country, especially the rural majority, who are more than 80% of the people who live in rural places in Ethiopia. So understanding the system and to be motivated to change it really comes with this understanding. If we change that, then eventually our own interest also could be realized. And in relation to understanding poverty, I think, I think there's writings by people like Ashish Nandi and others who reflected on the difference between poverty and destitution. Poverty is not the lack of food and water, but that is destitution. Poverty is a concept and how it is invented and created by experts to kind of talk about abstract measurements, indicators, and totally disregard the poor. So the poor do not exist in development discourses. The students do not exist in education discourses. Education is not about, right to education is not about learning from your experience. It's actually the right to Western education that exists. There is no a human right to study your language. There is no human right to study from your experience. There's only a human right to study Western knowledge, Western languages, and experiences. So a critical appreciative dialogue is a combination of three concepts. It's not dictating anything. It's a kind of allowing for different ideas, concepts that seem contradictory, but kind of mutually reinforcing one another to move us forward in advancing critical consciousness and epistemologies. So it is to be critical of power and also appreciative of people's agency, people's lived experiences, people who do not have voices, whose ideas are not articulated or not referenced, should be part of our learning, and we should be able to learn from them. And the dialogue is a form of engaging by considering these two. And there is one other concept that we can add, which might be useful, is I think epistemic humility. Humility is, how do we become humble? Because knowledge, in the way we understand it or learn in the Western system, actually creates a form of identity that makes us educators and change makers and so on. How do we really go away from that and exercise a form of humility, which says, like in the Ethiopian traditional system, for example, to know is to be humble in the face of others. how to conquer the ego, the self that we have, and be allowed to become vehicles of relationships, transmission of values such as love, friendship, and so on. So this type of approaches would help to enhance our ability to learn from others.
Okay. Wow, that's all the contribution, all the responses from our three speakers have been quite enlightening, and I'm sure there are lots of other questions that are still coming, and we'll try to continue to address some other issues that we have already outlined here. And I'm sure the issues will also be covered one way or another. So in our second question round, I will start with Dr. Altea, then Rosalba, and we'll end with Jirga's contribution in answering to these questions. The question that we'll be dealing now is, there is a wide misconception that equates diversity of authors in our particular course outline in terms of geographical origin, gender, or whatever kinds of other categories. There's some kind of misconception that this with decolonization of the curriculum. Whilst recognizing the vital role of having diversified authors in our reading list or our reading materials, how can we ensure that the diversity also addresses epistemic elements? So, Altea, you have the floor.
Okay, I'll try and be very concise
Thank
because
you.
we're running short on time.
Yeah.
So I think when you create a module, it's not just about the reading list, right? You're essentially telling the story of how the world has come to talk about or think about a particular topic or subject or phenomenon. And in that, there is recognition that particular voices, epistemologies, and experiences may have been excluded in terms of how you understand these things and in terms of how you see the world, right? So changes in the reading list kind of need to go hand in hand with the retelling of the story, right? The retelling of the story of the module and kind of our world. And therefore, it's important to think about unlearning the ways in which you've understood these things, your own positionality, and our global history. And so it's not just recognizing that voices have been marginalized, therefore, but also challenging epistemic violence. And that involves reimagining the topic, the debates, the story that you're trying to tell in the module. Right? So you asked for practical examples. So I'm going to give two quick examples. So I teach humanitarian, I'm convening the humanitarianism and AIDS postgraduate degree at SOAS. And humanitarianism is a field that is steeped in white saviorhood. It doesn't get worse than that in many ways, right? But in the course that I have, so the core module, one of the strategies that I've used, because I'm a decolonial feminist, just like Rosalba, is that I don't start with the history of humanitarianism as a Western project. Right. So we begin with re-envisioning humanitarianism, with challenging the idea or the terminology of humanitarianism itself, and thinking about how these ideas have been introduced or thought of throughout different traditions in the world. So actually the first few weeks of the course is looking at Chinese, Islamic, African, and indigenous kind of traditions around humanitarianism, or rethinking what that actually means, right? So we discuss, I think we start in the fourth week. We then discuss the Western project of humanitarianism, and that project, because we've already talked about how these ideas are, how re-envisioning humanitarianism can be rooted in different traditions, and different people have thought about these things long before it became like a Western project as such. It then, when we begin to talk about the Western project, it's situated in particular ideas. So we re-envision how to understand humanitarianism, and the course centers power throughout the entire term and that conversation. So it's a different starting point, and therefore you cannot get away from the global hierarchies of power and decentering that Western project, right? And really recentering different ways of understanding how we relate to each other, and different knowledges that are actually better knowledges in this context. I also talk about racialized and gendered experiences of humanitarianism and humanitarian processes, including that of racialized aid workers, right? So it's not just thinking about these things theoretically and kind of historically, there's also recognizing people, we have different perspectives as racialized people, and those particular bodies have different experiences within that Western project as well. So it's picking apart how we think about these things and who's important in the story.
Okay. Thank you, Altea. Rosalba, how do you answer this issue of conflating diversity of authors with the decolonization of a course or a curriculum?
Well, it has been really difficult, of course. The decolonial becomes a new participatory, for example, in the context of the Netherlands, and this is extremely problematic in many ways. But something that I would like to stress here is that the way I have been doing it in my classrooms is by always going back to one of the principal, let's say, premises of decolonial thinking, that there is no modernity without coloniality. And when I say this to the students, when we discuss this basic premise, we are constantly questioning also the project of decolonizing the curricula and decolonizing development studies, and always situating it as still a project within the epistemic territory of modernity. That is a conversation that is happening in relation to Eurocentric curricula, Eurocentric programs, but that cannot, let's say, contain all the struggles that are happening outside the university. And for me to situate this project is also helping me to narrow it down to its relevant future in terms of the institution that we call the university, but at the same time give some perspective to the students that are investing their time, their energy, their labor in transforming development studies and transforming curricula. And don't take me wrong, I think that is important, but we cannot simply reduce this struggle for example, political autonomy from where the decolonial comes from and originates in Aviala, to the fact of reforming our curricula. So I'm constantly remembering students, this is very much contained in a very specific institution, and we cannot just focus all of our energy on that. It's important, but it's not the whole story. So that is like the general framework in which I locate the discussion and the work that we do. Practically, this has meant that, for example, in one of the courses that I teach in the last term of the MA in Development Studies at ISS, is a course that we call Transitions to Social Justice. And something that we avoid is using abstractions. We are actually establishing a way of working that comes from popular feminism, popular activism in Aviala, that is called activated conversations. It's actually something closer to what Jirga was explaining. Activated conversations are ways of speaking that tend to avoid expert knowledge on the table. It's not that you don't have to use it, especially us trained as academics. Of course, we're constantly throwing up jargon, and it's quite difficult sometimes to explain in plain language what does heteronormativity means, or actually what coloniality means. But anyway, we are bringing this way of talking to each other. And instead of using abstractions, we use action verbs. Like, for example, we speak about the transition that is happening in global health, and instead of using global health, we use the term healing, because we can all say something about healing. We don't need to be necessarily medical doctors, but medical doctors are in the conversation, don't take me wrong. It's not something anti-science, not at all. Science has a place, a role, but it's not the only role. We decenter that sort of expertise as the only one or the universal one, but we have conversations with traditional healers or with people that are going to different process of healing the colonial wound with art and with different ways of intervention. But we are also having conversations about, for example, instead of talking just about capitalism, we also bring the term nurturing to go beyond production or productivism as a center of all the conversations that we can have. And therefore you can have people that are not necessarily within the confines of the institution of the academia to have conversations with us, with the students. And this goes for terms like, instead of education, we talk about learning. Instead of speaking about migration, because these days you cannot say anything about migration because then there are experts on migration, no? Anyway, the things that instead of speaking just about migration, we talk about hosting and traveling, because we have all have the experience of hosting and traveling. So we are decentering expert knowledge in my courses, not that we don't speak those concepts, we learn about those concepts, but we also learn to contain them into the very specific context where they emerge, that is the academia. And I, at the beginning, mentioned the academia is product of Eurocentrism and the advance of capitalism. So we need to contain them.
Okay, that's quite a revealing contribution to our understanding of decolonizing our curriculum, and even some of the terminologies. I remember during the teaching African development, there were some new terminologies that I was using with my students, and that's a new way of naming or framing gives power, or some kind of liberates you from that kind of very top-down approach of approaching or conceptualizing certain issues and social relations. And thank you, Rosalba, for highlighting that. Jirga, what's your experience with regard to diversifying your reading list, and how do you respond to people who say that so long as you have a diversified list of having lots of authors from South America or India or Pakistan or some from Africa, so that you have a good course? How do you respond to such kind of assertions?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think there is a lot of value in diversifying, of course, your reading list. And there is no lack of reading lists. Fortunately, we can have access to as many readers as possible. People from the Global South, for example, have written so many works. Whether their work, all of that work, is relevant or not is another question. So for me, it is not about diversifying the reading list, which is important. For me, it is actually a question what we believe to be the source of knowledge is. Where does our understanding of a changed or decolonial understanding of the world come from? And I don't believe that it primarily comes from reading textbooks or reading published accounts. However important that might be, we understand the institutional policing of ideas and how ideas and knowledges are produced. So as long as knowledge production is implicated in that colonial tradition, we don't really hear a lot of voices from people who are marginal, who are excluded, except as a data, except as an information to kind of supply some form of theory by the writer. So in my approach, I think, of course, we do have as diverse and critical reading list, but the topics are very important, and how we learn about the things that we are going to learn is very important. So we focus on methodology. And I give you an example. We have a unit called Human Rights History Across Cultures and Religions. So what we do within that course is to question this very concept of the human, this very idea of what does it mean to live by rights, and what does it imply? And also, what does it mean to understand the past as history, as opposed to, for example, legends, stories of peoples and so on? And how do we understand culture? What are the ways in which we understand religion? So a kind of a critical questioning of these concepts are very important. But another important dimension that goes with this is to invite people who have lived experiences within these fields to come to the classroom and teach from their experiences. I invite people from Islamic tradition, for example, scholars of Islam, scholars of Buddhism, scholars of Judaism, of Christianity, and so on. So these people come to the classroom and give the students, based on their lived experience and understandings of the world and how the world could be better, based on insights that they get from their own experiences. And after they lecture the students, then the students will have a chance to reflect based on what they get from them, to reflect on the world, on their learning, and to kind of capture, understand new concepts, so that they expand the grammar that they have in writing and describing reality or the world. So that is one approach. And the second important point, which has been mentioned repeatedly earlier, is the relationship between this diversifying knowledge or reading list versus the language we use to study these concepts. And it's very ironic in a way to think that we can do so much decolonial work using colonial languages. Because colonial languages, including English, have got these concepts that are very much not open to incorporate experiences and ideas that come from the global south. Imagine salmon work or gold, wax and gold in the Ethiopian tradition to be taught in English or interpreted and be part of that discourse. So language, it's very important to understand the limitations that we have in our work, because our work is quite limited by the language we use, and which is primarily the English language. And I don't want to take a lot of time, but it's really important also to think about the institutions. We thinking of challenging institutions without which we may not be able to have our careers. And as Rosalba was earlier saying, and also Altamaria was saying, issues related to safety, to what extent I can push, the frontier and be critical of, and what are also the things that we can offer, the things that we can replace. And there is a sense of vulnerability as well that comes with engaging with this type of ideas. And I think finally, as a way out, I think we should think of not just focusing so much in colonial constructions, but also focusing so much in building relationships, in building networks, in trying to know how to work together. And for example, what Roslava was talking about, using a new language and new words to really describe the world, that's very empowering, that we see things like that are important for us to learn from. So, we can diversify our way of learning by not just focusing only on the literature, but also on other things that do not often come to the literature.
Okay, thank you, Yurga. I think some of the questions that were already forwarded, at least somehow sent to me from the moderators, have already been touched upon one way or another. For instance, how do you incorporate indigenous knowledge or experiences in your teaching methods? I think what you mentioned, what Yurga mentioned and Rosalba mentioned, somehow addresses that. The intersectionality of the decolonial agenda is also somehow raised here. I think Rosalba mentioned it in one of her presentation, where most of the time, students that are coming from the global south are usually students who are already exposed to the Western ideology or experience in terms of their educational background or their socioeconomic status. So how do we ensure that intersectionality, so that that process should not somehow be disregarded, is, I think, one thing that we need to emphasize. There's one question directed to Yurga, but I would rather go for the third question that we have, and probably, because we have already used 1 hour and 5 minutes of our scheduled time. We have 25 minutes to go, but I want us to share another practical experience from our classrooms about handling classroom discussions. I think that the intersectionality element would be quite important here, because from my experience of teaching African development using decolonial perspectives, what I have kind of understood is, of course, some of the key issues that we were discussing in the course were quite new for most of my students. And some of them were saying that, why didn't we learn about these issues when we did our bachelor degrees? As you know, most of the time, development is usually a postgraduate course. And some of them were saying that, some of the issues that we discussed in the classroom were already being discussed in the dinner table of my students' household, right? So they found the concepts, the ideas, the history that we were learning, the topics that we were unlearning and unthinking were quite relevant. And so I had lots of students coming from other courses, not taking my course, but wanted to at least to read some of the course materials, because they were not exposed to them at all. But the problem was also how to handle the classroom discussions, because sometimes, usually people associate this decolonial thinking particularly with your skin color. So long as you are Black or Latin American or Asian, you have the authority to claim all the knowledge about decolonial thinking, kind of victimizing our colleagues from Europe or from North America or the non-Black students. So that kind of dynamism was quite challenging, and I want us to share our experience. How do you handle classroom discussions and debates so that positionality, that intersectionality would be used as a good input and element into our conversation rather than creating tensions within our classroom? Because the issue is all about politics, as Altia Maria mentioned quite a few times. So I will start with Jirga, then with Altia, then Rosalba. So how do you handle classroom discussions where such kinds of elements are coming into the conversation?
I think partly because probably the course I'm involved in, the Center for Human Rights Education, I work with postgraduate students who are quite interested in human rights and interested in making some change in the world, and a lot of them with significant work experience as well. So often, it is not too difficult to try to create the opportunity for them to discuss based on their experiences and their understanding. And I think one of the most important thing in this work is to really not answer questions or give a lot of ideas, but to know to ask the right questions, or to enable students to be comfortable with their ideas, that to understand that they have the right to speak and to tell their version of reality, because there is no as such a definite reality that has to be studied by others or by them. So with that approach, the first and most important step is to really have that clear understanding of getting away from this notion of kind of banking model of education where you deposit knowledge on others. They are there, we are there together to co-create reality, to learn about the world, and by using not just conventional but non-conventional languages and ideas. So that is critically important. Then on the base of that, we invite, for example, or we invite people who have lived experiences for in particular from the indigenous community here in Australia. These are people who have enormous culture, enormous history, enormous wealth that can be shared to so many people, even outside of Australia. But a significant part of their existence is not really visible, is not really known. So we take the opportunity to study and learn from them. These are not often, these learnings do not necessarily take place in classrooms. We go out in the field, we go out in the places where they live, in the place where they sit down and tell stories, and then we share those experiences with them. And another important areas is to also see spaces of different forms of violence. For example, when you study in relation to epistemic violence or the violence of knowledge, we can take the example of the accumulation of so-called artifacts, sources of knowledge collected from indigenous people, from Africans, from different parts of the world, and stored in museums and libraries, and stored there and kept there as artifacts. Whereas these materials, some of them are actually important textbooks, important icons of faith and learning. You can take the example of Ethiopian textbooks. Ethiopians wrote more than 1 million Giz manuscripts in their own languages, but none of us study those books. Those are stolen, looted by different organizations and museums, and they are everywhere in the West, most of them, a lot of them at least. So, but if you go back to Ethiopia, in places where traditional education is happening, the students do not have access to these books. They study, they try to memorize the texts from the mouths of their teachers. By seeing this type of contexts to show to students the level to which epistemic violence or the destruction of knowledge is perpetuated in the world, can kind of give an important insight when they go to museums, when they go to libraries, then they can differently understand the texts that they see there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jurga. So, Althea, what's your response to this question? Like, how do we ensure that the unlearning, the rethinking or the unthinking of Eurocentric epistemological order occur in our classroom discussions and among our students? And any practical experience with this regard, please?
Yeah, so I had actually prepared something else to say in response to this question, but I think I'm going to respond directly to what you've just kind of asked because it's really important. So I think creating a safe space, I've mentioned a few times, and so has Rosalba, is really important in the class, right? But that is different than catering to fragility, right? So I tend to, and I think it's important for us to recognize that, you know, silencing students, so students of color, for example, and students from the Global South are often silenced, right, in terms of when these topics come up, right? They feel that they can't speak, or they do speak and then they feel that they're essentialized and have to represent everyone. So often it's not a good experience for them, right? So what I tend to do is begin my class with discussions about these issues, right, in terms of not the curriculum, but the pedagogy and how we're going to like hold the space and each other over the term. And so there is an acknowledgement that we will talk about power, that there are going to be different and difficult conversations, that you have various positionalities, that you may be uncomfortable, right, that everyone comes in with different experiences and we are all equal in terms of what we bring. So there are not a set of rules, but there's a discussion about the learning space that we're going to engage with over the term, and I think that's really important because if we don't have those discussions, then one, students may not know what to expect because the institutions that we are in are very colonial and in terms of the content that they receive, but also it allows students to feel, I think, that it's a space where they can share their experiences or be empowered, and that's really important. So I think my approach is to not shy away from these things because my curriculum doesn't shy away from it, and I don't shy away from myself in discussions, but to allow them to recognize that and then make the decisions about how they engage with each other and whether they stay in the class or not. Really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, Rosalba.
Well, I simply need to echo what Althea has just mentioned. As popular educator, I'm trained as a popular educator as well, and I learned from popular educators here in Mexico. And the space of the classroom it's a sacred space in the sense of all the possibilities that it can have, not only for learning curricula, but also for transforming our subjectivities, understanding where are we coming from. And for that, you need to cater that space with principles. I call them principles of engagement that I don't design. I start with a session in which all the participants are co-creating them with simple questions as what find you difficult to hear, or what makes you feel uncomfortable and you try to run away or not being prepared to listen in the setting of a classroom. And then when we start to answer these questions, then we know which are the principles of engagement. But as Althea is mentioning, this is not necessarily saying this is a space in which everybody is going to feel comfortable. Not at all. This is a space in which tension is going to be present. And therefore, I spent perhaps the same amount of time planning each of the sessions that I spent in choosing the readings. Very good planning of an introduction, a pause, a debriefing, a follow-up with students who have experienced my own courses has been the way I have been navigating the decolonial. It's not something that I can claim any expertise, because actually the experts are the students that have gone through my courses, who have constantly shown me this didn't work, or this might work differently. And in the last couple of years, all the sessions of my courses are co-designed with former students of mine who come and said this can be done differently. For example, this idea of associating the decolonial with only students from the Global South is something that we constantly have to address, because then students from European descent, especially white students, then are not necessarily invited to the conversations. No, on the contrary, everybody has different burden in the process of decolonizing the self, of decolonizing our references when engaging in conversations. And therefore, our different positionalities bring different responsibilities. But at the end of the day, as the instructor, as the teacher, of course, I have to hold the space. I have to hold the space for people feeling not part of the conversation or overtaking the conversation. It's not easy, but it requires a lot of planning and a lot of time. That's what I can say now.
Okay, there are lots of questions forwarded by my colleagues to me, and I would just highlight some of them. I think some of them have already been addressed. Another issue that's already that was raised by our participants is usually the decolonizing agenda is somehow dominating topics on education and development, and I think the person wanted to know whether that's also the case in other fields of studies, and I think that's quite visible, and you can see lots of other decolonial agendas in other fields of studies, not only in education and development. But there's quite a good question down there where should we also be concerned about decolonizing or engage with the idea of decolonizing primary level, secondary level education in our entire education system, but not only in the university system. I think this question is quite important and already highlighted by Jirga, but if you want, please respond to that. There's another question from my colleague in the International Development Department, Laura Mann. She asked that, she said, thanks for the interesting panel. I wanted to ask a question about decolonization movement and the recognition and highlighting of pluralism within economics. Sometimes I think when people are critiquing, I'm reading this from my, okay, let me enlarge it. Oh, where is it? I think I missed it when I, okay. I think when people are critiquing economics and economic development models, they seem to be directing their critique more narrowly at the neoclassical paradigm of development, which is currently hegemonic, but this is not the only form of economics out there. The conflation of neoclassical economics as economics ends up reifying that hegemony and neglecting the contributions of many important heterodox economists from Latin America, Africa, Asia, such as Mushtaq Khan, Thandika Mkandawari, Raoul Prebisch, Nkrumah, or Hajung Chang, among many others. How can we make clear to students that the historical origins of development theory, I think there is a good question here. How can we make clear to our students that the historical origins of development theory are numerous and that development as an idea is not just a European idea? I would like to hear our panel's response to this. Ruth Kinuya has been raising questions about the inclusion of indigenous knowledge, and one question around that area is, as one of the panels mentioned, if the initial dynamics do not fully support a decolonized discourse. There was also another question about to what extent that this pursuing the colonial curriculum needs some kind of negotiation or conflict with our initial dynamics. So do the panels observe real-world progress in accepting alternative perspective? That is there applicability and recognition in the international development profession of the classroom conceptual frameworks? I wonder to what extent these questions really touch or speak to your particular location as an academic profession, as an academic professional in your respective field of studies. But feel free to respond to any of these questions in the remaining. So I will give you like 2-3 minutes each, so that we will end up our webinar. So may I start with Altia Maria? Would you mind responding to any of the questions?
Sure. So maybe the first question about, is it important to decolonize not just higher education, but other levels of education? I think absolutely, right? So it's not just about, decolonizing, I guess, or taking an educational justice approach to formal education, but really thinking about the spaces in which we learn and how we understand the world and relate to each other. Really, that's a much larger project, right? We're all situated in academic institutions today, but the work is much more expansive and historical than that. And then just quickly, the question about development theory, bringing in, so development to me, and I think all of us on the panel have spoken to about this today. It's not about the Western project as such, right? So if you attach development theory to the Western development project, then it is about Eurocentric knowledge in that sense, and resistance to that. But if you reimagine or re-envision what development is, so I always think of development as processes of change and transformation, and that is something that every society through the other history of the world has engaged in, right? Then the theory about that, and theory is always rooted for me in everyday life, right? So the meaning that we give to those different processes of change and transformation are also rooted in the experiences of societies all over the world throughout history, right? And that's where you can then bring in different theories and ideas into your learning processes or curriculums or departments or whatever spaces that you're in. So it's diversifying that.
Okay, great. Rosalba?
Sorry, I thought that I was the third one.
Sorry.
Yeah, other fields, of course, we are undoing colonial legacies. There is a whole project in which, here in the Netherlands, we are involved with curricula in primary and secondary schools. So, but what is important for me to mention about that is that when we are trying to undo colonial legacies, we also have to be aware of the plurality of the horizons that different struggles for decolonization have had over 500 years, related to land, to reparations, perhaps in other settings to inclusive education. There is a plurality of political horizons. In terms of the confusion and or the conflation between neoclassical economics and economics as a field, yes, I agree with you. But some of the cases, some of the authors that you mentioned, Raúl Prebisch, yes, of course, fantastic, but it's a product of a modernizing and Eurocentric discipline as economics. So he, of course, contributed a lot, but it was clear that his role as one of the elitist economists in Latin America reproduced many of the problems of development as an Eurocentric and I would say anthropocentric in kind project for humanity. So I have my own doubts that this is enough plurality. If we only said Prebisch or all the other economists. As for, there is a question that I really want to touch very briefly, this idea that to deconstruct is to decolonize. Please, no. There is a lot that has already been written. Deconstruction belongs to a specific geo-historical tradition of European critical thinking. And when we are talking about decolonizing, we have a different set of genealogies that are mostly coming from anti-colonial struggles. So one has to be very careful in confusing that what we are doing is deconstruction. Not at all. And just a reference, Kathy Walsh is someone that very clearly differentiated between deconstruction and the drive to undoing colonial legacies through the work of Fanon, but there are many others. So please, no, it's not the same.
Okay, great. Jirga, would you be comfortable to respond to any of the questions? Mike?
I can say a few words, yeah, a few things. I think in terms of thinking about the origin of development and how it is plural, of course, it depends on how we think about development, but what is, I think, for me, important in thinking something to be plural is to really understand that there is something behind it. When we think of ideas that come from the global south, these must be ideas that are rooted in how people live there. It's not based on how we respond to European writings, to challenge, to critique what they say. That's not just decolonial, but instead to kind of bring out, speak about the knowledges, ideas, and lived experience of people whose experience are excluded. So that is very important. And secondly, it's also important to focus not just the diversity of ideas, but their relationship to institutions. You can have a lot of ideas, but in the world we live in, certain ideas are selected and are put into practice by institutions. Not all ideas hold the same power. So in that case, we are deliberate, and I think we should be deliberate in focusing on the critique of these dominant ideas that are also put into action through institutions. And that is why I think focusing and decentering and critiquing Western dominant ideas of the economy are very important. I say that because it should not kind of water down. It's not kind of make it look like, okay, there are also economic ideas somewhere else. Let's just know about them and that is it. And that's not going to be enough, because we need to think about not just the ideas, but how the ideas are used by institutions and practice. And finally, I think there is possibly, this is just my own view, there's a possibility to think about decolonization not as just one thing. And in some way, it can be misused and can become, I can say sometimes it could become, even dangerous. And I say that in the context of Ethiopia. There is, to some extent, in the Ethiopian last 50 years, there is this rise of very critical ideas about decolonization in Ethiopia. But that idea was to focus on decolonizing Ethiopian traditional indigenous ideas by reading them as Western constructs. In recent times, especially when the country is divided into different ethnic groups, the different ethnic groups are regarded as nations. And in order to create national stories, they started to kind of incorporate ideas from Fanon, from the decolonial perspective, and claim that these nations existed in the past as autonomous entities. And that led to the ethnicization and the proliferation of violence and so on. And some of these critical ideas about decolonization are used to amplify and to kind of present Ethiopia's previous existence as a colonial existence, where the reality was not that Ethiopians fought against the Europeans and were excluded from the world. That's how they maintained their tradition and culture and so on. So in different contexts, we should have really a decolonial reading based on how people live, what people want, what they are thinking, not just based on how we respond to these dominant ideas that come from the West.
Okay, thank you. And we are running out of time, but I would like to give all the three speakers at least a minute and a half to wrap up. But while doing so, I'm asked by one of my colleagues that there was a question that at least the panelists need to respond to the questions that have more upvotes, and you have already responded to one of them. And the other with more upvotes is a question which says, isn't the fact that all your panels or our panels are researchers based in northern universities as a form of Eurocentrism? I think that's a good question to respond to. And by way of answering it, you can also have an additional 30 seconds to wrap up and finalize your contribution here. And I will start with Althea, then to Jirga, and I will finish with Rosalba.
Okay, so I think I actually picked up that question earlier on in the conversation, and I responded, and so maybe I'll just quickly repeat that. It's important that we don't, I would be interested to see who asked that question really, but it's important that we don't essentialize, right? So we all have complex experiences and positionalities and politics. And so we need to go beyond just where someone is located to think about, what is the imperative behind their work, what are their politics, and how are they approaching these particular ideas and topics, right? Because otherwise we just lend ourselves to really universalizing knowledges and ways of being and interacting with each other. And just quickly, in terms of the two things I wanted to say to wrap up, several people mentioned Indigenous knowledge, and just being a person of Indigenous descent myself, I just wanted to highlight that it's not just about putting Indigenous knowledge into the curriculum or the institution, because there's centuries long history of of appropriating indigenous ways of being and knowledge, particularly in terms of, now we see that happening with the climate change debates. And so we need to, I just want to say, to be careful about how we engage with these things, right? And also lastly, it's important, just to respond to one more question in the chat, that we reimagine colonial regimes and border thinking, right? And Rosalba talked about this a little bit, but it's not just about decentering Europe, it's about understanding how people in the globalized South, marginalized experiences, how they've connected to each other, right? So when we talk about the Haitian Revolution, it's not just about the Haitian Revolution vis-a-vis France and the Enlightenment ideas. It's about how slave communities in Venezuela, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Jamaica engaged with each other and what that story is, right? So it's resituating these different conversations as well.
Okay, great. Jirga, would you mind responding to the question about your position in a university in Australia as a manifestation of Eurocentrism, and any concluding remark? 2 minutes.
Well, I think as Maria was saying, right, I think I agree with that, because our identities have complexities, and as I said, yes, I have studied in the West, and I have a lot of my ideas and thinking are Western ideas. But at the same time, I also come from Ethiopian experience of the traditional system and the rural area. That is an area of knowledge and space that I want to amplify and talk about, not just to talk about it, but to try to encourage us to listen and to learn from that experiences. And I think for me, one of the most important questions is to ask, who is a teacher, or who is the person who is telling us about the ideas that we are learning? And that question is important because we need to invite people who are not professionals, who are outside of the classroom or the academia, because their knowledge and ideas represent the people's and the people's lived experiences and so on. So with that, then I think, yes, I can say I'm West. I live in a Western university, and I'm a Western person. And if I go to Ethiopia, I would have a privilege to be treated as a knowledgeable person, although my knowledge, significant amount of my knowledge, is based or learned in Western universities, whereas the professors and the indigenous people who taught me, or the traditional people who taught me, have studied for 30 years in their traditional system, and are so knowledgeable in Ethiopian knowledges. They are not treated as professors or doctors, whereas I would be treated like that. So my challenge for us is, how do we overcome that? How do we actually allow ourselves to be students, to learn from those who really know a lot about the world where they live in? Okay,
great. Thank you. Rosalba, I respond to that question, and also concluding remark, 2 minutes.
Well, yes, I think that is a very important question, despite its politics. But the way I answer is with also quoting again Olivia Rutatsiwa. We might be in an institution, but we are not the institution. Perhaps because of our complex positionalities, we can understand how institutions work and realize that we are not necessarily part of that institution, because we come from complex subject formation experiences. So I tend to see the limitations of institutions, perhaps because of my lack of trust on institutions. But anyway, I think that the other challenge that we have is that in many cases we are using the tools of the masters that keep dehumanizing us. And given the parameters of those possibilities, we understand that these tools are not telling us the whole story or the whole picture of what we can do and how we can actually decolonize ourselves and others. And finally, we're speaking through a colonial language. Yeah, and my main language is Spanish, another colonial language. And this brings me to my last point, that is this, that even that we're using a colonial language to communicate each other right now in English, there is a lot of time that we have to invest in learning each other, in connecting our stories of different processes of subject formation, different stories of undoing colonial legacies. So it's as complex as that, as Althea was mentioning.
Okay, great. That was a great contribution from all of you, and I thank you on that. And I think as a way of also just adding on that, I think it's quite important not to conflate that our epistemic position, our epistemic location, our epistemic identity may not necessarily relate to who we are or where we are based. It doesn't really matter whether, of course it matters, but the epistemic location should also be given serious consideration one way or another. We are 7 minutes behind schedule, but I think we had done a lot in terms of covering lots of issues around decolonizing development studies, or in general practical issues about course designing, reading materials, and also handling classroom discussions. I don't know how to wrap up this, but I will just simply emphasize that thank you for my panels, Althea Maria Rivas, Rosalva Ikaza, and Jirga Gala-Weldejes, and also my colleagues from the Institute for Africa, Kojo Ajepai and Anna Dalton. For our participants, we had nearly like 150 something participants from the very beginning. At an hour mark, we had 120, I think. Now we have around 86. So it's dwindling, but I think the questions that we raised were quite useful. This is just a beginning of somehow broadening the conversation about the decolonial agenda. We are not here to give answer to each and every question. We are just reflecting and responding to some of our concerns and also sharing our experiences. I think we have managed to do that in a very good way, and I thank all the panelists in doing so. So without any further ado, I would like to call an end to this panel, and round of applause for those of us who can clap, or those of us who can feel each other. And thank you everyone for your attendance. I hope the recording of this webinar will be available on the YouTube channel, particularly on the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa YouTube channel. So you can definitely go back to it and hear more from our speakers. And also all our speakers, their professional bio is available in their respected university sites, so you can reach them and talk to them and continue the conversation in any way that you want to. So thank you for your time. Good night to Jirga. Have a good day to Rosalva, and have a good afternoon for Althea Maria.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao. Ciao.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Ciao, Jirga.